Good afternoon, and welcome to the boardroom of the National Transportation Safety Board. I'm Robert Sumwalt, and I'm honored to serve as the chairman of the NTSB. And joining us today are my colleagues on the board, the vice chairman, Bruce Landsberg, member Earl Wainer, member Bella Denzar, and member Jennifer Homendy. I'd like to also recognize and welcome to the NTSB our friends from the Swedish Accident Investigation Authority who are visiting the NTSB this week. Thank you and welcome. Today we meet in open session as required by the government and the Sunshine Act to consider an incident in which an Air Canada Airbus A320 lined up to land on a taxiway instead of a runway at San Francisco International Airport on July the 7th, 2017. When the incident pilot looked down at the airport on approach, he saw two parallel lighted surfaces. He thought he was seeing runway 28 left and 28 right. But 28 left had been closed less than an hour earlier for construction. So what he was actually seeing was runway 28 right, where the flight was cleared to land, and parallel taxiway Charlie, which was to the right of 28 right. A notice to airmen, or NOTAM, advised of the runway 28 left closure. The flight crew had received this information in a flight release hours before the incident, and then again in flight before the descent from cruise altitude. The closed runway, 28 left, was marked with a flashing white X. So I ask, was it an easy mistake to make? If you're expecting to see two runways, perhaps. As we'll discuss, such an expectation played a key part in this incident. However, there were differences between the runway and the taxiway as well. As events unfolded, fortunately, no lives were lost, no passengers or crew members were injured, and no aircraft were damaged. But there were 4 passenger aircraft lined up on that taxiway. 2 Boeing 787s, an Airbus A340, and a 737. And the Air Canada airplane descended to a low altitude above the taxiway. The crew sensed that something was not right, and they initiated a go-around over the taxiway, avoiding aircraft by very narrow margins. Now, I don't want to sensationalize it, but this was a very close call. We've oftentimes found in accident investigations that a whole chain of events must go wrong, and fortunately, in this incident, the chain was eventually broken. Preventing the next accident relies on removing the links from a potential accident chain at every opportunity. This afternoon, we'll examine several aspects of this incident. We'll discuss the flight crew's fatigue and the role that it likely played in their misidentification of the intended landing surface. We'll examine expectation bias and how this may have affected the crew's perception of the airport environment. We'll also examine the presentation and priority of the runway closure information that was provided to the flight crew. In addition, we'll discuss technology that could provide critical warnings to pilots and air traffic controllers when an airplane is not lined up with a runway surface. Today, the NTSB staff will present the most pertinent facts and analysis found in the draft report. The draft report is over 100 pages. Our public docket, which is available at www.ntsb.gov, contains more than 700 additional pages of information. Staff have pursued all avenues in order to propose findings and recommendations to the board. The board will consider this work, then will ask questions to ensure that the final report truly provides the best opportunity to enhance safety. Now, Managing Director Dennis Jones, if you'll please introduce the staff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A few announcements before we begin. I kindly request the folks here in the boardroom, if you have not already done so, please silence your mobile phones and other electronic devices. There are 2 exits in front of the auditorium, one to my left, one to my right. Go down the stairs, out the door, and follow the illuminated exit signs to depart the facility. You may also exit to the rear of the auditorium and proceed out the glass doors you entered, go up the stairs, and exit straight ahead through the large glass doors to the outside. Once you have exited, turn left and follow the sidewalk to the end of the street. In the event of emergency, please walk quickly to the nearest exit and make your way to the outside following the instructions of NTSB staff personnel. Do not delay. Do not return to the boardroom until instructed or advised to do so. If you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to contact any NTSB personnel. Joining us at the panel today, unless otherwise noted, are staff members from the Office of Aviation Safety. Starting on the front row to my right is John DeLisi, the director of the office. Next is John Lovell, who is the investigator in charge. Next is Captain Sean Etcher, who will be handling operations. Next is Dr. Cynthia Silva, who will be handling human performance. Next is Betty Koshik, who will handle air traffic control. Directly behind her, on the second row, is Jeff Marcus, who from the Office of Safety Recommendations and Communications. Charles Cate, who will handle flight data recorders from the Office of Research and Engineering. Next is Karen Stein, report writer. Next is Jim Ritter, who is Director of the Office of Research and Engineering. Next is Kathleen Silbaugh, who is our General Counsel. Next is Paul Slezik, Director of the Office of Safety Recommendations and Communication. Directly behind him on the third row is Marie Moeller, who will handle aircraft performance and also is our visual and timer. And next will be Mike Hoff, sequence of events aspects. We will start with comments from the Office Director, John DeLisi.
Good afternoon. Today marks a first for the NTSB. This will be the first time a full major investigative report is being brought to the board for an event in which there were no injuries and there was no aircraft damage. Staff has previously investigated incidents involving taxiway landings, but those landings occurred on unoccupied taxiways. However, when we learned of a passenger airliner almost touching down on a taxiway occupied by 4 other airliners, we elected to launch a full investigation. By applying our resources to this investigation, including experts in operations, air traffic control, airport, human performance, airplane performance, and flight recorders, we were able to develop a draft report that represents the real strength of the NTSB, our ability to perform a deep dive into the circumstances of an incident which could have resulted in a potential catastrophe. The evidence we collected and analyzed in this investigation resulted in the draft report you will consider today, which proposes 19 findings, a probable cause, and most importantly, 7 recommendations aimed to prevent a similar occurrence. John Lovell, the investigator in charge, will now give the opening presentation.
Good afternoon. On July 7, 2017, at 11:56 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time, Air Canada Flight 759 and Airbus A320 was cleared to land on runway 28 right at San Francisco International Airport, but instead lined up with parallel taxiway Charlie and overflew 4 airplanes waiting on the taxiway. The Canadian registered airplane was operating under Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 129, as a scheduled international passenger flight from Toronto, Canada. Night visual meteorological conditions prevailed at the time of the incident. There were no injuries and the airplane was not damaged. This slide shows the San Francisco runway and taxiway layout. Runway 28 left, runway 28 right. The red line shows the extended center line of runway 28 right. Taxiway C, or Charlie. And this blue arrow shows the approach path of Flight 759. At the time of the incident, runway 28 left was scheduled closed for construction work with a flashing X positioned on the approach end of 28 left. This information was included in the flight crew's dispatch information and was included in the ATIS information that was current at the time of the incident. Flight 759's takeoff, climb, cruise, and descent were uneventful. The captain was the pilot flying, and the first officer was the pilot monitoring. After contacting Northern California Approach Control, the flight was cleared to fly the FMS Bridge visual approach to runway 28 right. The bottom of this slide depicts a profile view that shows altitude as Air Canada 759 approaches. Flight data recorder information showed that the flight aligned with Taxiway Charlie when the airplane was about 3.6 nautical miles from the runway at an altitude of about 1,100 feet above the ground. When the flight was about 2/3 of a nautical mile from the seawall, about 300 feet above the ground, the first officer radioed the tower controller saying, "Just want to confirm this is Air Canada 759. We see lights on the runway there, across the runway. Can you confirm we're cleared to land?" The tower controller responded, "Air Canada 759 confirmed cleared to land runway 28 right. There is no one on runway 28 right but you." The first officer acknowledged the tower's transmission when the airplane was 500 feet from the seawall and 150 feet above the ground. According to FDR data, Flight 759 initiated a go-around at 89 feet. After the go-around was initiated, the airplane descended to a minimum altitude of 60 feet before beginning to climb. I will now play the video that shows the final approach and initial go-around. To orient you, here is a still photo of the airport surveillance video. The camera is looking east from the terminal across the airport. Air Canada 759 is circled in red and will be approaching from the right to the left. 4 airplanes on Taxiway Charlie are circled in yellow in the upper left portion of the picture. The video will play twice. The safety issues identified in this investigation relate to the need for consistent FMS auto-tuning capability, effective presentation of relevant flight operations information, equipment to alert flight crews landing when the airplane is not aligned with a runway surface, modification of surface detection equipment to identify potential taxiway landings, more effective signaling to flight crews of the closure of runways when one or more runways are closed at an airport, and revision to Canadian duty regulations to address reserve flight crew fatigue. Parties to the investigation were the Federal Aviation Administration, the National Air Traffic Controllers Association, and Honeywell. In accordance with ICAO Annex 13, the French BEA appointed an accredited representative as state of manufacture and design of the airplane, with Airbus designated as technical advisor. In addition, the Transportation Safety Board of Canada appointed an accredited representative as state of registration and operator, with Air Canada Pilots Association, and Transport Canada designated as technical advisors. The following NTSB staff participated in the investigation: Mr. Chairman, this concludes my opening presentation. Captain Sean Etcher will now give a presentation on the operational factors of this incident.
Good afternoon. I will discuss the flight crew's requirement to manually tune the instrument landing system, or ILS frequency, verify that navigational aids were properly programmed for the approach and set up in the cockpit, which would have provided backup guidance for the visual approach. I will also discuss the placement of the frequency information within the approach guidance. Air traffic control issued instructions to the flight crew to fly the FMS bridge visual approach to San Francisco's runway 28 right. Air Canada's FMS bridge visual approach for runway 28 right required pilots of Airbus A320 series aircraft to manually enter or tune the ILS frequency into the airplane's flight management computer. The first officer, who was the pilot monitoring, did not enter, nor did the captain, who was the pilot flying, verify that the ILS frequency was tuned. During post-incident interviews, the first officer reported that he must have missed setting the frequency, but was unable to provide a reason as to why. Because the ILS frequency was not entered and verified, the flight crew could not take advantage of the ILS's lateral guidance capability to ensure proper alignment with the intended runway surface. A post-incident review of Air Canada's A320 database revealed that the FMS bridge visual approach to San Francisco's runway 28 right was the only approach in that database that required manual tuning of the ILS frequency. The flight crew might have failed to tune and verify the tuning of the ILS frequency because Air Canada A320 flight crews were not required to take this action for any other approach. Only requiring manual tuning on this one approach created an opportunity to miss this step, an omission error. Also, the presentation and position of the step to manually tune the ILS frequency would not have been prominent to the flight crew during their review of the approach procedure. The FMS bridge visual approach procedure to San Francisco runway 28 right consisted of 2 pages. The first page, which is shown on the screen, included a pictorial view of the approach. The second page, which is now shown on the screen, included textual guidance for Air Canada's Embraer and Airbus A320 fleets. For the Airbus A320 fleet, the guidance provided flight crews with, among other things, the instruction to tune the ILS 28 right. This instruction was embedded in the middle of the paragraph on the last page of the approach chart, and the position and presentation of this information were not optimal for capturing pilot attention. After the incident, Air Canada revised its procedures so that the FMS bridge approach to runway 28 right would be flown as an instrument approach. However, staff's investigation of this incident determined that a safety issue exists regarding manual tuning and the prominence of that information on approach charts. In summary, staff determined that had the requirement to manually tune the ILS frequency been more conspicuous, and had each flight crew member adequately reviewed and cross-checked the approach requirements, the crew would have had the required backup lateral guidance to align with runway 28 right. Without this lateral guidance, the crew was not aware that the flight had unknowingly aligned with Taxiway Charlie. Staff is proposing a recommendation to the Federal Aviation Administration to work with air carriers to assess all charted visual approaches that require a backup frequency to evaluate auto-tuning capability for charted visual approaches. Then, identify approaches that require abnormal manual tuning and develop solutions to address required manual frequency input. This concludes my presentation. Dr. Silva will now provide a presentation on human performance for this incident.
Good afternoon. My presentation describes crew expectations during the approach, crew awareness of the parallel runway closure, cues and recognition of the misalignment, mitigations to overcome expectation bias, and crew fatigue. The crew had an improper expectation that two parallel runways were available as they approached the airport and had intended to line up with the right side runway. However, with 28 left closed and unlit, the crew misidentified the lighted runway as 28 left and flew towards Taxiway Charlie, thinking it was 28 right. Captain Etcher described some crew performance errors in his presentation. While these can also be described as breakdowns in crew resource management, it was ultimately the crew's expectation to see two runways that biased their interpretation of available cues and led to the misalignment and delayed go-around. Expectation bias refers to the tendency to weigh cues that confirm an expectation higher than contradictory cues. It happens in various circumstances, and since people may not be aware it's happening, it can be difficult to recognize. A runway closure notice to airmen, or NOTAM, was issued and reviewed by the crew. This information, however, was not recalled when it was needed during the approach. Upon review, staff found that this information was not effectively presented. Before departure, the NOTAM was included on the flight release page, here. Although some features of the NOTAM were emphasized, its position in the middle of a 27-page document was not optimal. In flight, this information was displayed as a text message in the cockpit. Its formatting and the location of the closure information likely reduced its usefulness in flight. Staff has proposed a recommendation to more effectively present this information to pilots. Cues supporting the crew's expectation that they were approaching runway 28 right included construction lighting on runway 28 left appearing similar to ramp lighting, runway 28 right looking similar to runway 28 left, and several features on the taxiway that were consistent with the runway. This illustration represents lighting on the runway and taxiway with aircraft holding on the taxiway. The taxiway with airplanes had features consistent with runway centerline, edge, and approach lighting. Cues contradicting the expectation included the taxiway not having full-length edge lights or normal approach lighting, taxiway centerline lights being green instead of white, and flashing guard lights being positioned across the taxiway. Although these differences may seem obvious, expectation bias can be a powerful influence on human perception, where conflicting features are often overlooked. The first indication the crew was attempting to reconcile the difference between their observations and their expectation occurred when the first officer called the tower to verify that the runway was clear after the captain noticed lights across his runway. The controller relayed that the runway was clear, however, this contradicted with the lights that they were seeing. Several additional cues that contradicted the crew's expectation occurred in the moments before the go-around, including radio transmissions from the first airplane on the taxiway expressing concern, a landing light switched on by the crew of the second airplane on the taxiway, and the incident airplane's own landing lights beginning to illuminate the ground. While the crew was not able to specify what triggered them to abort the landing, it's likely that these cues contributed to their decision to go around. This delay in recognizing the misalignment is also consistent with the effects of expectation bias. Human factors research suggests several methods to overcome expectation bias. Providing pilots with information that clearly identifies aspects of their environment that may be different from normal is one method. For example, neither crew member recalled seeing the flashing X on runway 28 left, indicating its closure. Had they recognized that surface was a runway, it would have met their expectation to see two parallel runways, and they likely would not have misidentified Taxiway Charlie. Given the flashing X was designed only for aircraft lined up on that closed runway, staff has proposed a recommendation to improve runway closure cues to benefit aircraft lined up on adjacent runways as well. Another way to overcome expectation bias is by introducing salient cues that reflect the actual situation. A cockpit alert or advisory reflecting the projected landing surface could improve crew awareness and prevent misalignments. Staff has proposed recommendations to equip airplanes with these technologies. The crew was fatigued as they had been awake for an extended period of time and reported feeling tired as they conducted the approach, which was around 3 a.m. Eastern. Fatigue can degrade performance and increase susceptibility to expectation bias. Although the flight complied with Canadian flight and duty time limitations, if U.S. regulations had applied, the captain, as a reserve pilot, would not have been able to take the incident flight. Staff has proposed a recommendation to improve Canadian regulations to better address fatigue for pilots on reserve operating late-night flights. As a result of the human performance-related safety issues identified, staff has proposed recommendations to improve presentation of information to pilots, equip airplanes that operate in busy airspace with systems to alert when the airplane is not aligned with a runway surface. Further, develop technology that alerts when an airplane is not aligned with its assigned runway. Research ways to more effectively signal a runway closure at night, and improve Canadian regulations to better address fatigue. Thank you. Ms. Koschig will now discuss air traffic control in this incident.
Good afternoon. I will discuss air traffic control staffing, the operation of the Airport Surface Detection Equipment System, or ASDE, previous recommendations about this technology, and safety improvements with technology that has advanced since the recommendations were issued. San Francisco Tower was staffed with 2 controllers on the night of the incident. One controller was working all positions and frequencies combined in the tower cab, and the other controller was on a break in the building. The controller working in the tower at the time of the incident stated that the traffic complexity was normal before the incident occurred and was not overly busy. ASDE is a runway safety tool that was designed to detect aircraft and vehicular movement on the airport surface and then present those images on a tower display. The safety logic software in the ASDE systems predict a potential collision on a runway based on the current or projected movement of an aircraft or a vehicle. When the system predicts a potential collision on a runway, it produces a visual and oral alert to the controller. When an alert is activated, the controller must immediately assess the situation and then take appropriate action. The ASDE system was not designed to predict a taxiway landing. Therefore, the system worked as designed and did not produce an alert. In March 2011, the NTSB recommended that the FAA perform a technical review of the ASD system to determine if the capability existed to detect taxiway landings. That recommendation specifically referred to one of the three ASD systems, the ASD Model X. The NTSB also recommended that the FAA, if feasible, modify the ASDX system to detect taxiway landings and provide alerts to the controllers. The FAA did not perform technical review, yet they determined that the performance trade-offs would outweigh the safety benefits of providing recommended capabilities. In September 2011, the NTSB classified both recommendations as closed, unacceptable action. In this incident, had the San Francisco ASD system been capable of detecting a taxiway landing, visual and oral alerts could have assisted the controller in identifying the potential taxiway landing. Since the time that the recommendations were closed, the FAA has developed taxiway arrival prediction software and conducted tests to determine if the ASDX could predict taxiway landings. The test provided promising results, showing that the system was able to predict taxiway landings and provide visual and oral alerts to the controllers when the aircraft was within 20 seconds or 3,000 feet of landing on a taxiway. In May 2018, the ASDX at Seattle Airport was enhanced with the taxiway arrival prediction capability. The FAA is evaluating other airports equipped with the ASDX for the software enhancement. Staff is proposing a recommendation to the FAA to modify all ASD systems at those locations where the system could detect potential taxiway landings and provide alerts to air traffic controllers about potential collision risk. This concludes my presentation.
Thank you. In summary, staff's investigation concluded that the flight crew planned to land on runway 28 right, but their lack of awareness that runway 28 left was closed led them to misidentify taxiway C as runway 28 right. Their failure to use the instrument landing system to back up their visual approach, their expectation bias, the effects of fatigue on an overnight flight, and a breakdown in their crew resource management all contributed to the misidentification. Moving forward, how can we prevent an event like this from happening again? Staff has proposed recommendations to develop a solution to auto-tune the backup navigation aids, to better present and prioritize information in flight release packages, and to develop and implement warnings to both pilots and control tower personnel when an approaching airplane is not aligned with the correct runway. In addition, we propose a recommendation to Transport Canada to better combat fatigue for pilots who are called up from reserve duty and asked to fly overnight flights. That concludes our presentations, and we welcome your discussion on the draft report.
Thank you very much, Mr. DeLisi, and to the entire staff of Aviation Safety. Very, very relevant report, and I think the recommendations, if adopted, will go a long way towards improving safety. We'll now turn to the board member questions, beginning with Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, it's amazing to me that here in 2017 we got this close. We've been flying airplanes for a long time now, and this is perhaps a classic indication of the accident chain of link after link after link, getting us ever closer until just at the very last minute, and you could probably get different opinions on what exactly broke the chain, but we couldn't have gotten literally or figuratively any closer to having a major disaster. I think this may be self-evident, but I'm going to ask the question anyway, having to do with NOTAMs and so forth. It seems like there's a greater interest in making sure that nothing, regardless of its importance, is left out, as opposed to making sure that critical items are highlighted. as one former associate administrator of FAA safety said, if everything's important, nothing's important. And this isn't a new problem. This has been going on for at least 2 decades. Our aviation safety reporting system has had many reports of poor user friendliness on the part of the NOTAM system for both air carrier and general aviation operations. Captain Etcher, approximately how many NOTAMs were provided to this crew in their pre-departure package and on their ACARs? Do you have any idea?
On their pre-departure or their flight release packet, the crew had about 3 pages of NOTAMs for San Francisco, but that also included another 5 pages of other NOTAMs. So about 8 pages of NOTAMs in total on their flight release packet.
And the really critical one, which I would normally consider runway closed as being kind of a critical NOTAM, that wasn't highlighted in any way?
When Dr. Silva was presenting her presentation, she had a spot there where it showed that Air Canada on the flight release had actually put a red asterisk with the term new beside each runway closure for San Francisco to make it stand out a little bit more, which, as her presentation showed, was on page 8 of the flight release.
Okay, so that sounds like it wasn't considered that critical, but they would sort of do something there. The red asterisk, but not really high up. Okay. Have we been able to determine if the runway closure symbol, the flashing X, was visible to the flight crew at any point as they were on the approach? We have 2 parallel runways that are in close proximity to each other. And so I'm just curious as whether the crew would have, if it would have been possible for them to have seen that.
When we interviewed the crew, they made no mention of seeing anything off to the left side of what we know is 28 right. In fact, they said it was dark, so we don't know if they actually saw the lighted X.
Okay. I think another point that has been well made, I think we need a new acronym, HCT, that would be Human Circadian Time. The fact that they were operating at 3 o'clock in the morning their time, and that the captain was awake for 19 hours. It's just amazing to me that in today's environment, and as many times as we on this board have made the statement about operator fatigue across all modes, and yet somehow these things continue to happen is just amazing. And for reserve pilots to be on duty for that long is just nuts. That's a technical term. No further questions at this time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Vice Chairman. I'm certainly going to hit on that NOTAM issue in a few minutes. Member Weiner.
Thank you, Chairman Sumwalt. I'd like to kind of explore the process of passing information about the situation and the overflight. So one of the reasons we don't have a CVR is because it wasn't recognized by all of the right people that within 2 hours the CVR ran out. Had the seriousness of the situation been recognized, they could have pulled the circuit breaker and it would have saved the CVR. Needless to say, we would have known a lot more about what was going on in the flight deck if we had that. So hypothetically, if an air ATC controller is working alone and becomes aware of a near catastrophic event, such as a collision with multiple airplanes in this case, what obligation does a controller have to report this event? Meaning, how soon must it be reported and to whom?
The air traffic controller was required to submit a mandatory occurrence report, and that has to be done no later than the end of the shift. And they usually submit that into the CDAR system, which then it will go up the chain. And as in this case, that when the supervisor came in that morning, At the end of the shift, they reviewed the replays, and then it started going forward when they found out the severity.
So no matter what the seriousness of the situation is?
No, sir, it falls under that category of, the aircraft attempted to land on a surface on the airport, that the severity doesn't play into it at that point, because he did not understand the severity at that point, the controller.
Now, part of the reason we've got such a safe 121, airline operation is because of the reporting culture that we have through SMS and ASAP and so forth. What about the pilot's responsibility, the flight crew's responsibility to report a situation like this?
In Air Canada's manuals, they had it very clearly specified. There's, correct me, I believe 47 events in which they need to report, of which a select few of those need to be reported immediately. However, in this event, the crew considered it a go-around. That's something that has to be reported under their guidance as soon as possible. And that's what the crew had done the next day when they filed their air safety report.
Going into the docket, it looks like the controller was pretty shook up about it, as well as the pilots who talked to him on the phone was pretty shook up about it, which seems to be different than something that was just casually reported many hours later. So do we have any understanding of why the pilots tended to minimize the situation?
We don't state necessarily that they minimize the situation at this point. The evidence that we have regarding their knowledge of the event was consistent in different aspects, as well as consistent with human performance when it comes to processing information without your brain actually realizing what it was you're processing. So all of that is pretty consistent. Both the controller did state in his interviews that he felt like the crew or the captain was shaken, but out of context, we don't want to put any kind of assumption onto why, because keep in mind, this is a foreign crew calling someone in an authority position, did realize he lined up with the taxiway, so we can't say that the anxiety or anything stated in those interviews necessarily was associated with any more information they had.
Okay, let me yield the time here.
Thank you, Member Weiner. Member Denzar, thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Sumwalt. And thanks to staff for putting together this investigation, even though I know you were confronted with a lot of gaps in the available information that would have been helpful. So good job on that. I wanted to clarify on this line of questioning about the reporting. Captain Etcher, you mentioned that the Air Canada requires pilots to report on a certain number, 47, is that right? Types of incidents as soon as possible. And what was the mere fact that it was a go-around in this case that required the reporting?
When we interviewed the crews and even personnel at Air Canada, they all kind of aligned with the fact that it was because it was a go-around that it was needed to be reported as soon as possible.
And that was why, that was one of the 47, and that's why they decided to report it. And,
yes,
and is there a definition given by Air Canada for what as soon as possible means?
At the time, there was not a very clear definition of it. Since the event, they have now redefined as soon as possible to give a little bit better clarification on what that term means.
Thank you, Captain Etcher. And what is it now? I mean, is the pilots reported it the following day. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes, ma'am. And now it actually says to accomplish promptly or as soon as time permits is their new definition of it.
Thank you. I think we're all human, and mistakes happen. I was curious about the timing of the reporting, and I'll have to. That may come in the next round. I do want to ask about the lighting on the runway. I mean, looking at the photos, even as a non-pilot, it seems that Taxiway C, it's marked with a green color, but I understand there's expectation bias and a lot of things that can come into play. So would you explain to me why it is that we say that in the findings that airport lighting was not a factor?
Ultimately, in finding one, we do say that airport lighting was not a factor, and the reason that we say that is because the lighting itself was up to standards, met standards, and it was also used per the guidance. We had runway approach lights that were on 28 right. The lighting for the closed runway was off, again, per regulations, to avoid having someone land on that runway. And also the lighting settings, in this case, were consistent with the regulations. So for this incident, everything regarding airport lighting met standards. And when it comes to how they may have been improved, that's where the recommendation would come in.
Thank you, Ms. Silva. And I know that staff has proposed recommending that FAA conduct human factors research to determine how to make a closed runway more conspicuous. So what are the considerations that have to be taken into account for developing this kind of effective lighting?
Well, it's twofold. One of which is you are signaling a closed runway, so you do have to make sure that your signals do show that clearly that the runway is closed. The other aspect, though, that it can provide is if it's visible to other parallel runways, for example, then you provide that situation awareness of, let's say you did miss the NOTAMs, but you're expecting to see two surfaces. What can cue me to, okay, like that's a runway, but it's closed. So I'm not going to worry about that one, but it's consistent with my expectation. So those are the things that you would consider. Biggest picture, which is why we really went with a research recommendation, is that you have to evaluate for unintended consequences. And there are a lot of options on how to improve the system. And it's relevant there for the research to be all-encompassing.
And can lighting be distracting as well?
Yes, it can. So that would be an unintended consequence as well. So overall, there's a lot of work to be done when improving the system for awareness to parallel runways.
Thank you, Ms. Silva.
Sorry.
Thank you, Member Denzar. Member Hamady.
Thank you. There's been an assertion that the air traffic controller may have been task saturated or overloaded, so I'm hoping to clear some of that up. And you'll have to forgive me, I'm not on aviation or military time, I'm on railroad time still. So for me, it is at 11:55 p.m. and 45 seconds. The flight crew told the controller that they saw some lights on the runway. They then asked the controller to confirm that they were cleared to land. How long did the transmission take, the flight crew's portion?
It took the flight crew 6 seconds to say that.
Okay, 6 seconds, because it seems this 7 seconds is at issue here. So 6 seconds for the flight crew transmission to be completed.
Yes, ma'am.
Then the air traffic controller responded
immediately a second later.
1 second. In that time, in fact, I think several documents say that the controller in that 1 second didn't just respond, but also checked the radar display and another display and rescanned the runway. Is that correct?
Well, as soon as the pilot started asking the question, the controller would automatically look at the airplane. So he's going through his process at that time, scanning, as the pilot's talking.
Okay, great. And so was there any indication in your investigation that the controller at this time lost situational awareness of Air Canada 759 or seemed confused in any way?
No.
No. And at the time, there was one controller in the tower. The other was on break. Was it unusual to combine positions and have single-person operations in the tower at that time of day?
It wasn't unusual.
And does FAA allow that?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And finally, did the controller provide any indication that the single-person operation affected his workload at the time of the incident?
No, ma'am.
Okay, great. Since I still have a little bit of time, and I have other questions that I'll hold for later, but I wanted to circle back on the NOTAMs. The NOTAMs, while it was on page 8 of, I guess, 27, it was under the header of runway, correct? So it was number 1 on the under runway heading, correct? So it wasn't just number 1, but then you had in red 1, 2, 3, 4 red with asterisks on it. Number 1 is the runway closure, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So then, and it wasn't just this opportunity that the flight crew had to see that there was a runway closure and they had to take some actions. It was also they had an ACARS message that came through on the flight. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, because I brought my own. Actually, on the 4th line, it talks about runway 4 was closed on this day. But my point is it wasn't just one opportunity at the beginning, pre-departure. It was again while it was on the flight.
Right, and do note that the crew did recall reviewing NOTAMs, and the captain specifically recalled reviewing that one.
Correct. Okay, great. Thank you, and I'll hold some questions.
Thank you, Member Hamady. And I said in the opening statement that this was a very close call. I'm not sure that we've heard in this board meeting what distance staff is estimating this to be between the two aircraft. Have we already said that? I don't. And what would that distance be, vertically speaking?
The distances between aircraft was about 13 feet, but we tried to indicate that it was close, but given the some of the challenges, we wanted to just give more of an overview and not so much focus on that detail.
That's fine. I think the report mentions that figure, but I think in the general sense. And Ms. Mueller, would you like to address that?
There were a number of different ways that it was measured. There was the altimeter on board, and then there was also using the image, but we decided between 10 and 20 feet was the separation distance.
And that's what I'm looking for.
Okay.
That's what the report basically said, between 10 and 20 feet.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, it was a very close call. Yep. Now, I tell you, I've flown this approach late at night before. I will tell you that it's a very demanding and high workload approach. You're trying to make crossing restrictions at the right altitudes. You've got to cross Thoreau at or above 6,000, Garot at or above 4, Janney at or above 2,500. and then the F-101D fix at or above 1,200 feet. It's high workload. You've got to make those altitudes. If you're too low, you're not good. You're below the altitude that you should be. If you're too high, then you're going to be too high for the 3-degree glide path you should be on. It's important to be on those altitudes. The runway is this runway offset from the final approach, Captain Etcher?
There is a few degrees offset from the runway itself, from the approach.
Okay. And in addition to workload, you're coming in over water. It's a black hole. I remember looking out about the same time of day that this crew is coming in there, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning on my clock, because I'm coming from the East Coast. You see these approach lights out in the water. It's eerie. It's a tough approach. And so it's demanding. And I can understand, based on what Dr. Silva and the report has said, I can understand how this error would have occurred. This was not a crew that was inexperienced. The captain had 20,000 hours. The first officer had 10,000 hours. So based on my airline piloting experience and based on my combined 12 years of sitting here at this dais, I think I've come up with 2 salient points. One is, and they've already been identified, the NOTAMs. They didn't comprehend the NOTAMs that the runway 28 left was closed, and they didn't manually tune the localizer frequency. And I think if either of these had been done, we wouldn't be sitting here today talking about this truly disturbing event. But the NOTAMs, boy, the NOTAM system is really messed up. I can tell you that right now. So they're not 8 pages, Mr. Etcher, Captain Etcher, of NOTAMs. There are 10 pages of NOTAMs for this dispatch release, and as Member Hamady pointed out, it's on page 8 of the dispatch release, which they're reading on an iPad. And these NOTAMs, there's one on here that says, and by the way, they're written in some kind of language that only a computer programmer would really understand, but the bottom line here is coming out of Toronto, taxiway AK, taxiway R between taxiway B and taxiway AT, between taxiway B1 and taxiway R, not authorized to aircraft with wingspans greater than 214 feet. Captain Etcher, you flew the A320. Is the wingspan greater than 214 feet?
Actually, I did not fly the A320. I only wish I had that experience you did. But no, I do not believe
No, it's
101
feet and 8 inches. And so why is that even on there? And that's what NOTAMs are. They're just a bunch of garbage that nobody pays any attention to. Remember, Hamady and I flew down to Charlotte on the jump seat a couple of weeks ago, and just pages and pages and pages of NOTAMs, including birds in the vicinity of the airport. And you ask me, when are birds ever not in the vicinity of an airport? These things, if you were to read them, every one of them, you would spend at least 20 minutes going through the NOTAMs and trying to understand them. So I've got a flashing light. I'll quit on that, but I'm going to come back to this topic, and I expect you to pick up on NOTAMs too. It's your turn.
Thank you, Chairman Sumwalt. I think you have very adequately driven the nail in.
Oh, no, we're going to hear more.
Well, it's this problem with NOTAMs has, as I said, is nothing new. This has been going on for a long time. Unlike the chairman, I still do take to the air periodically, and maybe they should issue a NOTAM when I do. But operating, even in a light airplane, we just get pages and pages and pages of irrelevant material. The important stuff gets buried. So I would hope that our recommendation will thoroughly address this and make a strong case. This crew, they'd had a long day. Had they been aware of what was going on, I don't think we would have had this problem. And as the chairman has pointed out, had they thought to tune the primary navigation system, which is a normal procedure for this airplane and this approach, that wouldn't have happened either. I have another question here, and I think it goes to maybe a bigger one. And it's very easy to second guess Monday morning quarterback, what the crew did or didn't do, and so forth. It took them 16 hours to get around to reporting this incident after it happened. And it was stated in section 2.4 of the report, page 105, that there was no indication that the crew was aware that they had overflown 4 air carrier aircraft on the taxiway. Now, this was despite United Airlines making a transmission on the tower frequency, so they would have heard this. Where's this guy going? He's on the taxiway. 2 more transmissions from United Airlines saying that Air Canada flew right over us. So I find it a little hard to think that, well, we were just offset. The crew also stated they didn't see any aircraft on taxiway C, although several of the aircraft on the taxiway stated that they had turned on all of their lights. The controller on an unrecorded line said he was trying to calm the pilot down. So it's absolutely natural for the crew to feel a concern of embarrassment, quite possibly of retribution from their management for having had this. My question, after all of that preamble, is did you get any sense from them that they were afraid that we talk a lot about just culture and the fact that, if you self-identify that you made a mistake, and we all do, that they were afraid that if they said, hey, we screwed up big time, we missed several things here, and so forth, we were tired, and so on, that they were afraid that they were going to get hammered for it?
During the interviews with the crew and also the personnel at Air Canada, those questions or questions like that came up, and we got a consistent no, there would be no retribution. Air Canada had an SMS just culture system in place, so crews could feel free to state the facts and not be concerned of maybe any devastating retribution. I mean, there may be events that they'd have to retrain or something like that, but there was no indication that the crew was concerned of possible losing of their certificates or their job for reporting that.
Dr. Silva, do you have any thoughts on that, given the human factors aspect of this?
Sure. As Captain Etcher said, we didn't see any evidence during our visits to Air Canada that there were any issues with their just culture. They had a pretty robust safety program and reporting culture, from what we could tell. When it comes to the human performance aspects of the cues that you mentioned and the evidence that you stated earlier, at the end of the day, when you put yourself into the crew's perspective, right at the time of that go-around, right when everything's processing, you've got a high-stress situation, and it's consistent. They mentioned that they never heard any comments on the frequency until their call sign was mentioned by the controller to go around. And again, that's consistent with selective attention. You're going to hear your name. You're going to tune out other transmissions. So you're seeing the omissions that the crew missed are consistent with human performance in this kind of environment. So while it's possible, while we know that information existed to them, it's also conceivable that with human limitations that it would not have actually been committed to memory.
Thank you.
Vice Chairman Landsberg, thank you very much. Member Weiner.
For the ATC tower, what information in the tower was there in terms of where the airplane actually was in the vertical, and is there any indication of heights? Now, this had basically the latest ASD system in it, right?
Yes, sir. But at that point, no, they didn't know the height on it.
So because he didn't know the heights, the controller didn't have an awareness of how serious this event was?
The controller did not know the severity of this He actually he wasn't looking at the display. He was looking at the aircraft, which was his responsibility to do. And even looking at it, he could not process the severity of it. It was hard to tell. It was night. It was a mile and a half away.
So he marked it as, in Cedar, as non-significant
Yes, originally. Yes.
Change the subject here a bit. The Quiet Bridge approach is an FMC or FMS approach. What's the function of the localizer? Because it's basically an FMS approach.
Although it is an FMS approach, the localizer would also provide the crew with the guidance so they didn't cross the center line of 28 right into 28 left if there was simultaneous approaches coming in. So that it would give the crew positional awareness to make sure that they were aligned with the runway as well during that time.
Because they're intercepting at an 11-degree angle?
About 11 degrees. I can't do math very well today, so it looks like somewhere around that.
I get in trouble when I do it in public. Yeah.
Exactly.
So there's basically the localizer's role here is to keep the airplane from going into the space for 28 left, because that's about as close parallels as we have, is it not?
I believe it is one of the closest, yes.
On another subject, the flight crew reported that they were fatigued, and indeed the captain had been, 19 hours since he'd had significant rest, 12 hours for the co-pilot. What is Air Canada's policy on cockpit napping?
Air Canada does have a policy for controlled rest in the cockpit, and they have procedures that dictate how long a pilot can be resting and the procedures for transferring control for pilot monitoring and pilot flying to a single pilot, as well as transferring that back. So they do have a policy for this.
So what are the restrictions in terms of what phases of flight that can, where pilot napping is accommodated?
It would be in cruise.
Just in cruise. And did they take advantage of that policy at all on this trip?
In this trip, they did not.
Okay, I think I'll yield the balance of my time.
Thank you, Member Weiner and Member Dunzar.
Thanks, Chairman Sumwalt. And first, Dr. Silva, apologies for using your incorrect title before. To go back to identifying the severity, it seems that it was difficult to determine who first identified the severity of this incident. Is that a correct assumption? Maybe Mr. Lovell.
This didn't fit the normal reporting, and it needed to be looked at by the manager after the MOR was filed. They had to try and assess what information they had. So it was not readily, they were not readily aware of the severity initially.
And I think Ms. Koschig explained well why the traffic safety control didn't identify the severity. Why was it that the pilots didn't identify the severity immediately? Because I assume they would have reported it much more quickly had they known it was as severe as it was.
As was discussed, they did have the conversation with the controllers, and they did meet the following day, and they did finally report it. We don't have sufficient detail to really assess them on a more personal note as to their feelings or their assessment of it beyond the information we have. So the report tried to reflect things with balance based on the information we have.
And I know that the other, the aircraft that were on the taxiway, some of them expressed their concern in some statements. Is there any manner for other, and this is not to cast blame, but merely to, identify perhaps potential severe incidents? Is there a way for other pilots to report potentially severe incidents such as this? I know they were trying to take off and they were probably ready to get on their way at that point, but it did seem from the comments from the other cockpits that there was some concern.
There's always ways for crews to air their concern, if you will, and draw attention to what's concerning to them. As far as the United flights, a few of them especially had actually, once they reached their destination, which I believe was Sydney and Singapore, a little bit of a lengthy flight, once they got there, they notified their company via their ASAP program to draw attention to it so the ASAP program could look into it even closer to see if there's something that needs to be done from the United standpoint as well.
So all of the reporting would be within the company, is that correct?
Yes, under ASAP it is within the company. However, ASAP is also directly fed to NASA ASRS data. So other people in a roundabout way can get that. And the company also would typically reach out to air traffic control, in this case San Francisco, to get some more information as they do their investigation. So it would get out in a way that pilots can get it out.
Thank you, Captain Dutcher, because it does seem unfortunate that we didn't have the benefit of the cockpit voice recorder transcript, as I'm sure Mr. Cates would agree. And the report does conclude that the CVR information would have provided more evidence for some key issues. Mr. Cates, could you tell us very briefly what we might have been able to determine, or any other findings we might have been able to determine if the CVR hadn't been overwritten, if it had been available?
Sure. The CVR provides useful factual information that can help guide the other group chairmen in their investigations, things like conversations inside the cockpit, verbalizations of actions that the pilots may be taking, things like state of the aircraft, any alerts that they may have received, oral alerts in the cockpit, things like that that the other group members can use to make their analysis assessments of what was happening inside of the cockpit.
And is it common practice that this is overwritten? I mean, is that just all the airlines? I mean, I know there's certain regs, but do all the airlines follow that standard of overriding?
The standard is for 2 hours for cockpit voice recorders to record 2 hours, and that's pretty consistent.
And there's no airlines that go over that, is that right?
Not that I know of.
Thank you, Mr. Cates. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Member Denzar. Member Hamady.
Thank you. I want to circle back with Ms. Koschig. And you answered this before that Member Weiner asked. Was the controller able to visually discern from the tower that the flight was lined with the taxiway instead of the runway?
No, he wasn't.
And the air traffic control tower at SFO is equipped with a system that can detect an imminent collision of aircraft or other objects on runways and taxiways. But can the existing system also predict an imminent collision involving an arriving airplane lined up with a taxiway?
Okay, the system can detect a potential collision on a runway, but that is what our recommendation is for, that it will detect collisions on taxiways, and Seattle already has that implemented in their system.
So can you talk a little bit more about the difference between ASDI and ASDX?
There's 3 different systems that the FAA has. We've got the ASD-3, which is basically radar surface detection. The ASD-X, the Model X, it's a grade above. It has, it has different kind of radars, multilateration that it uses. And the ASSC is the latest version, and it incorporates ADS-B, and it has more abilities than all of them together. But the ASD-X is very comparable to the ASSC.
And has NTSB previously issued any safety recommendations on ASD-X?
Yes, ma'am. In 2011, we issued a recommendation that the ASD-X, that the FAA do a review to see if the ASD-X was capable of detecting taxiway landings. And that review did not happen, and they did not apply that capability to the ASD-X systems. So we closed it unacceptable.
Unacceptable.
Yes, ma'am.
Was that based on another, that was based on another incident?
Yes, ma'am. Out of Atlanta, at Atlanta Airport in 2009, we had a Delta that landed on a taxiway.
Mm-hmm. And so it's closed unacceptable, but how did the FAA respond? Did they respond in writing? What were their concerns?
Yes.
The FAA wrote to us in their initial response to those recommendations and essentially said that it would degrade the performance of ASDI to a level that it would be unsafe for the intended purpose of preventing runway collisions. We did not see any of the details of their analysis, so we closed it unacceptable because it appeared that they had just said they weren't going to do it. In our letter that closed it, we invited them to give us details of the analysis they had done, and we would reconsider that classification. They never took us up on that offer.
And there was testing of the system that NTSB witnessed, correct? And did you see any sort of performance degradation or any evidence of that?
No, we didn't. Actually, it was the testing started happening last year, and but the technology has advanced considerably since the time that we put in our recommendation, and I believe now that it's to the point that they can fix, that the degradation doesn't happen.
Okay. And last, do you know how many airports currently are equipped with ASD-X?
35.
35. Okay. Great. Thank you very much.
Member Hamady, thank you very much. Ms. Mueller, if you'd pull up slide number 26, please. I'm still on this bent for the NOTAMs, and can you unhighlight that part where it says 28 left? 28, yeah, okay, well, that's all right. You pull it back up again. So that's the raw, that's what it looks like, and anybody can say, well, it's right there. It says that runway is closed. But remember, this is one of 10 pages of junk. And this happens not to be junk. This is something that you need to know. Now, Captain Etcher, read this top line to me. Read what it says, actually the second line of the first NOTAM. What does that mean? Tell me in English what all of that means.
You're putting me on a spot now, aren't you?
But every airline captain has to do this, and they have to read every one of them and comprehend them before every flight. So
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
It says this was I got a glare on the screen there, but I can see where it says San Francisco runway 10 right, 28 left closed. And then the portion after that it's closed between July 8th at 0600 Zulu to July 9th at 1500 Zulu. But I got a glare on the screen. I keep moving my head, and the glare keeps getting worse. So,
but that's what it says. So what on earth does 06Z mean? 0600 Zulu. We don't deal with Zulu time around here. What does that mean? This is a crew that's leaving Toronto, which is on East Coast time. So what does 0600 Zulu mean? Does that mean that that runway is going to be closed when they get there?
it actually does.
because 06 Zulu, you have to subtract 7 hours to come up with 2300, which is 11 o'clock at night.
You are correct.
So it's all that simple. So anyway, that's, you know, if I've show some displeasure with the NOTAM system, it's because I am. I have it clearly, because it's not written easily. You've got to read 10 pages of it. You've got to comprehend it. You're being held responsible for it. And most of the time, 99.9% of the time, it's just garbage. The vice chairman told me a few weeks ago that Congress passed a law that the FAA was supposed to do something to clean up this NOTAM process. So to the staff in 2012. So has any work been done on that to clean up these NOTAMs, to anybody's knowledge?
The FAA informed us that as far as they were concerned, there were no open items remaining from the issues they were told to tackle in the Pilot's Bill of Rights.
Okay, but we will issue some recommendations about NOTAMs today, I think. So, very good. Let me ask you something. Was this the only crew that had problems with this identifying the proper runway on that night?
The crew that landed just prior to Air Canada also had stated that they had difficulty at the beginning.
And what made the difference between that flight, which is a Delta 737, and this flight?
So in that case, they cross-checked their lateral guidance on the aircraft to verify their position.
Okay. So another crew also noted problems with that. Now, we noted earlier that this is the only approach in the Air Canada database that requires a manual entry for the ILS for the localizer frequency. And what has Air Canada done since then to rectify that issue?
Since the event, Air Canada has now taken the steps to allow their crews to fly this using the computer guidance that's programmed in as an approach. And so that way the aircraft can actually be flown by the autopilot almost to the threshold of the runway.
Okay. So they've rectified that issue, is that if they just load the approach, it will give them the lateral guidance that they need.
Yes, sir.
Okay. I asked earlier if this runway was offset from the final approach. Yeah, the final approach on the FMS bridge visual to runway 28 right, the course is 275 degrees. Runway heading is 284 degrees. And also having a reluctance to do math in public, I pulled out my calculator, and it is about a 9-degree offset. That's coming over the black hole with 7 crossing restrictions that you have to make. So it is, like I said earlier, it's a tough approach. You've got a lot going on. Vice Chairman, questions for you, sir?
Just one, sir. On finding 14, page 121, we make the statement that flight safety would be enhanced if all airplanes landing at primary airports within Class B and Class C airspace were equipped with a cockpit system that provided flight crews with positional awareness that is independent and dissimilar from the current ILS backup capabilities. What data do we have to support that, and that all aircraft, regardless of operational capability, would need that to significantly reduce the risk? And the reason I ask is I know that there was an FAA summit on this topic, and there were some differences of opinion relative to that. And general aviation in particular was identified as a moderate risk, whereas the larger aircraft were identified as a significant risk. So I'm curious as to why we would make an all-encompassing recommendation in that regard as opposed to focusing on the area where the primary risk is.
In our original draft version of this recommendation, we looked for that system to be applicable to all aircraft. Upon further review and discussion individually with the board members, that was sensed to be a bit of an overreach. So we refocused our efforts on this recommendation And looking at this accident, this incident, the population we were looking to protect were passengers sitting on taxiways in airliners. And we tried to scope this appropriately so that the airplanes that are a threat to collide with them while they're sitting on a taxiway are covered by this recommendation.
It's still a pretty broad reach. Class Bravo, perhaps, but when you throw in Class Charlie, you've got a lot of airplanes and a lot of territory included. So I think we can have that discussion further, but no further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. Member Weiner.
Just one last question, and it's not about NOTAMs. The report indicates that the Air Canada crew, as we talked about earlier, came within 10 to 20 feet of striking another aircraft. Yet the crew reported to Air Canada that they never descended below 500 feet. Is there a human performance explanation for such a misunderstanding of altitude?
So in this case, the crew did say that they believed that they conducted the go-around at 400 feet. Operationally, at this point, they were visual and were not looking at the altimeter. And in this case, it's possible that some of the cues in front of them could have affected their perception, but that's not unheard of.
So it had nothing to do with perhaps the outline of the taxiway. Were there side lighting on the taxiway?
There was not edge lighting on the taxiway. The three of the aircraft that we're holding did have wingspans that were about the width of runway 28 right. That could have created an illusion of a partial edge profile, but there were no taxi lights on edge taxi lights.
Okay, and the last question is, had the runway 28 left been illuminated, would that have likely eliminated this missed lineup on taxiway Charlie? In other words, giving them the picture that they're used to.
If the crew had identified 28 left as a runway, it likely would have alleviated the risk. When it comes to lighting up a runway that's closed, there are risks associated with that, so that's something that we would not necessarily advocate for unless there was research to support that.
Did the San Francisco airport operators do any sort of risk assessment of closing a runway off?
As far as we know, they did not.
Okay, thank you.
Member Denzar.
I have no more questions, Chairman.
Thank you. Member Hamady.
Thank you. I want to circle back on finding 14. Flight safety would be enhanced if airplanes landing at primary airports within Class B and Class C airspace were equipped with a cockpit system that provided flight crews with positional awareness information. You mentioned, Mr. DeLisi, that in the first version it was broader, but in this one you've proposed limiting it to Class B and Class C airspace, and in my view, focusing more on this incident because, can you define Class B and Class C for a second?
I might be a little easier to handle the definitions of Class B and C. When it comes to airports, it's based on, I believe, emplanements. But there's also when it comes to the airspace, there's also very specific requirements for airplanes to be equipped with two-way radio communications and Mode C transponders in both Class B and Class C airspace.
In Class B, that would be San Francisco.
Correct.
Okay. So in this way, you have narrowed this a little more to take into account this particular incident. Thank you. And Can we go back to the reporting? And I'm wondering if someone could walk us through again what occurred, because I think there may be some discussion or assumptions that the crew knew how serious this was. And maybe that there could be some questions with some of the transcripts, but I'm not sure that we can jump to that, because I think there are other things in the transcripts that indicate they weren't really aware of how serious it was. But they did at one point, or at least immediately, call back into air traffic control, correct? Maybe, can you walk us through what happened once the landing occurred and they were back at the gate?
So, taking it from the ATC's perspective, the incident happened on Friday night, just before midnight. After that, the crew talked with the controllers, and then in terms of other things that went on, the controller, filed an MOR. And Saturday in the AM, the flight departed with another crew. Saturday morning, then you have the air traffic manager reviewing the tape. About midday, ATC spoke with the pilots, and that's on Saturday, and that's pretty much it from an ATC standpoint until Sunday when we were notified. Now, from the crew's standpoint, I mentioned that they talked with the controller, and about midday, we were told that they met and discussed what happened, and later on Saturday, they found out more details that they possibly had a pilot deviation. And Saturday afternoon, which would be the 8th, they called their dispatch and spoke with their dispatch.
At some point, they filed a safety report, or there was no Wi-Fi and it didn't go through, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Switching gears for a second, SFO, there was another Air Canada incident 3 months after this one in October, and then there was an Aeromexico incident at SFO 3 months after that. Did we look at I believe they were lined for a different runway. Do we look at that at all? We didn't? Okay. So we don't, that begs the question, is there a problem at SFO because 3 occurred in a period of 6 months?
We do not have that information.
Okay, okay. And can you discuss I'm over my time. Sorry about that, Mr. Chairman.
Great, we'll come back. Thanks. Okay. If I'm not correct, I may be correct. I think one of those other events at San Francisco was maybe just not checking in on the wrong frequency or something like that, and maybe landing without landing clearance or something. I'm not sure about that, but so I want to ask about fatigue, and Dr. Silva, you mentioned this. We know that that this was operating right in the captain's, in the flight crew's window of circadian low. So that was at 3 o'clock in the morning on his body clock. The window of circadian low is generally between about 2 and 6 in the morning. Time since awakening, we know, was 19 hours. Was the captain, to your knowledge, running a cumulative sleep debt?
He didn't indicate, based on his 72-hour history, that he had a cumulative sleep debt.
Did he have any sleep disorders that we know about?
No.
Okay. But at least we know that 2 of the issues that we usually look at, the boxes were checked on those. So I don't have any doubt that he was fatigued, and we believe that may have may likely have affected his performance.
Yes.
Now, explain to us, you said earlier in the presentation something about the Canadian duty time limits, and according to the report, it said that the captain could have legally remained on duty another 9 hours or so, so he's getting in at 3 o'clock in the morning on his clock, and he could have been on duty legally another 9 hours? Can you explain that?
Technically, according to the Canadian regulations as they stand now, that would have been permissible.
Okay, and would that have been permissible under the U.S. regulations that were recently revised coming out of the Colgan air crash, Part 117?
It would not have.
So it would not have been allowed under the U.S. regulations. And we have recommendations to Transport Canada, draft recommendations proposed to them. Okay, thank you. Ms. Kochak, do we have any concerns that there was only one air traffic controller in the tower this evening?
No, sir.
Well, maybe staff doesn't, but I do. And I know that this is allowed, but where's the redundancy if you only have one person in the tower? I'm in favor of people taking rest. I think that's important, but it sort of defeats the purpose of having two people on duty if one of them is going to be taking a rest for 3 hours. But it does appear that this controller was awfully busy. And what things has San Francisco, the tower, put in place as a result of this? That they're not going to go to a single tower single controller operation until a little bit later in the evening?
Yes, sir. They've extended that time and put in a standard operating procedure that they would not break down to one controller until 12:15.
Thanks. So I've got a question. We've got draft recommendations. Mr. DeLisi, this might be for you. We've got draft recommendations to increase the the CVR time from 2 hours to 25 hours, and certainly I intend to support that. But why did we not reiterate recommendations for cockpit image recorders? Haven't we recommended that for a while? Okay. So, Mr. Ritter, you thought you were going to get off, but
it's actually a good question. As far as the cockpit voice recorder rec, one of the reasons that's drafted as a separate recommendation to the board is that in this case, 25-hour CVR would not have captured the event. So an image recorder would require even more memory. Obviously, we haven't had much luck with our image recorder recommendations over the years. They've been in place since roughly 2000. Quite a long time, and no, they were not put in the report.
Thanks, and it would be an easier lift for the 25-hour because, as I understand it, ICAO has adopted a SARP or a requirement or something. I guess it's a SARP for aircraft manufactured after like the 2021 transport category airplanes to have 25-hour CVRs. Is that correct? ICAO has already come up with that.
Yes, sir, that's correct.
So we would just be aligning with what ICAO has come out with.
Yes.
All right, thanks. I guess we have more questions from the board. Would you like to continue the round, or do you want to take a break now? Okay. Who has additional questions?
I have an observation.
An observation.
Are they allowed?
That counts.
Okay. First off, relative to memory, I believe you can buy multiple terabyte drives these days for under $100 or a couple of $100. So I guess I'm a little curious as to why this seems to be a technical problem. I suspect it's something other than a technical problem on image recorders. Relative to the air traffic statement and the single controller in the tower, this sounds an awful lot like the problem we had in Lexington with the Comair flight taking off on the wrong runway. And whether that was necessarily the case here, it just there's a lot of similarities, and I was kind of hoping that we would have had that hole plugged by now, that when the controllers get busy, and I know and have a lot of friends who are controllers, and by their mindset, they are type A personalities, and basically they say, just bring it, and they keep piling on, I can handle it, until I can't. In this particular case, the controller was doing fine, but I think there was a significant time lag from the time that there was a question voiced until a response came back, which could have been critical. So any observations on that?
As Member Hamidi mentioned earlier, we had a crew that questioned ATC, and that transmission itself took 6 seconds. The controller responded within 1 second, so that is totally acceptable when it comes to response time.
I got that, but there was something in the report about something that came up that was like a 30-second delay. So that when you're moving at 160 knots on final approach or 140, you're covering a lot of ground at that point. So that's what I'm curious about. I'll find it here.
The delay that we mentioned in the report, which is relevant to our finding specifically about frequency congestion, and this is a perceived frequency congestion. We don't know exactly when the captain noticed lights on the runway. If we had had the CVR, it's possible we'd have more certainty on that. We had a range, so we calculated the time it took from the crew. The first officer said he believed that it happened before 600 feet. And we looked at the air traffic control recordings from that point on. We do not have a recording of what was actually transmitted on tower frequency. We only have a recording of what the controller heard, which was all of the transmissions there. So what would have been occurring on tower frequency is the responses that the air traffic controller made. So in this case, we refer to this as a perceived frequency congestion because people on the tower could only hear half of a conversation, and that specificity is what the crew mentioned delayed their query to ATC.
Yeah, I'm a little confused here because if the controller is handling all frequencies, which I think he was the sole person in the tower, he was handling ground, he was handling clearance delivery, he was handling local control, plus while dealing with the tug or something like that. He's going to have all of those frequencies. The aircraft on the tower, the aircraft on tower frequency are only going to hear what's on the tower frequency. So they're going to have long periods of silence where other stuff is going on, but they're not getting a response. So it's almost a distinction without a difference from what I'm saying. And I'm not articulating this well, but I've seen this before where you've got something important you want to say or get a response to, and you're not getting it because either A, you can't get a word in edgewise, or B, the controller is distracted on another frequency which you can't hear.
Member Weiner?
Yeah, I'd like to circle back to the question about when was it recognized and who recognized the seriousness of the incident? It's one of those, when did they know it and who knew it?
When the transmissions were made by the United crew, certainly that caught the attention of the controller, and also subsequent to that, I believe that is what made it seem more urgent or more critical. I think the UAL crew saying he's basically that he's lined up on the taxiway and then that he flew over us brought about the seriousness of that, and then that caught the controller's attention, and that brought about further activity in terms of the MOR and speaking to the crew afterwards. So I believe what really caught the attention and brought it to the forefront was the statements from the crew that were sitting on the ground.
So after that recognition, was Air Canada the next organization to be notified of the seriousness of it?
Member Weiner, I'm not sure we understand your question.
Well, it looks like Air Canada was notified by the FAA. They notified the Transportation Safety Board of Canada, which notified NTSB, and then we notified the FAA. Is that the chain of notification?
The chain of notification was that the controller spoke with the crew, then the crew spoke with their company. We were notified on the 9th by the FAA after they had reviewed the tape and informed us of the event. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's fine. Thank you.
Member Dentار. Thank you. Member Hamady. Yeah, I'm confused about this time. So, Dr. Silva, the bottom of page 109 on to page 110. It says, and we're talking about the time, well, I'll just read it. According to the post-incident interviews, the captain's request for the first officer to verify with the tower controller that runway 28 right was clear occurred between the time that the airplane passed FD or F101D at an altitude of about 1,100 feet and the time that the airplane reached an altitude of 600 feet. The airplane descended below 600 feet at such and such time, so the flight crew did not break into the conversation until 38 seconds later. So I'm not clear on this, so if you could try to clear it up for me.
As was written in the report, what we looked at was the times that the crew, the latest time that the crew could, or the captain could have noticed that, which let's say was 600 feet. And we took that time and compared it to the time that they actually broke in. And that's where that 38, I believe it's 38 seconds comes from. And we evaluated the ATC transcript in that time frame to see what kind of frequency congestion existed. And in that case, that's specifically what we discuss in our conclusion.
And was there frequency congestion during that period?
We state that there is perceived frequency congestion because of the fact that the Air Canada crew would only have heard partial conversation on the frequency.
So don't we have we have the ATC transcript? I mean, so why, and we listened, did we actually listen to the tape? We did. So, Ms. Koshag, based on your experience as an air traffic controller, was there congestion, yes or no?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. That's all we wanted to know. So that's part of the reason I'm concerned about one controller being in the tower cab, because one could be dealing with this airplane that's being towed. He could deal with that on the ground control frequency, and the tower would be dealing with local issues. Okay. So really, what I believe we're doing here is we're taking we're looking at multiple levels of defense, multiple layers of defense. If we do what this report calls for, we will have NOTAMs that will be presented in a more salient manner. We will want pilots to always back up the precision nav aids. We want, when something is uniquely different about something, like the need to manually tune a nav aid, that the company should do a better job with presenting that information and not just burying it in with other text. We would have onboard systems, like the onboard system in the cockpit, to alert crews of potentially non-runway landings. The ATC tower would have a system like an ASDX to alert controllers of something like this. The controllers would not be short-staffed to prevent oversaturated controllers. And we would have better, more conspicuous line lighting and marking to denote when a runway is closed. So we will take a break. We'll be back at 3:40, and we are in recess. Is there anything else, any further questions or discussion before we move on to the findings? If that's the case, Mr. Jones, if you'd please read the findings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a result of the investigation, staff proposes 19 findings. 1, none of the following were factors in this incident. 1, flight crew qualifications, which were in accordance with Canadian and U.S. regulations. 2, flight crew medical conditions. 3, airplane mechanical conditions. And 4, airport lighting, which met U.S. regulations. Recommendation 2, the first officer did not comply with Air Canada's procedures to tune the instrument landing system, that is ILS frequency, for the visual approach, and the captain did not comply with company procedures to verify the ILS frequency and identifier for the approach. So the crew members could not take advantage of the ILS lateral guidance capability to help ensure proper surface alignment. 3, the flight crew's failure to manually tune the ILS frequency for the approach occurred because 1, the flight management system bridge visual approach was the only approach in Air Canada's Airbus A320 database that required manual tuning of a navigation frequency. So the manual tuning of the ILS frequency was not a usual procedure for the crew. And 2, the instructions on the approach chart to manually tune the ILS frequency was not conspicuous during the crew's review of the chart. 4, the first officer's focus on tasks inside the cockpit after the airplane passed the final waypoint reduced his opportunity to effectively monitor the approach and recognize that the airplane was not aligned with the intended landing runway. 5, the flight crew initiated low-altitude go-around over the taxiway, prevented a collision between the Air Canada airplane and 1 or more airplanes on the taxiway. 6, the controller responded appropriately once he became aware of the potential conflict. 7, errors that the flight crew members made, including their false assumption that runway 28 left was open, inadequate preparations for the approach, and delayed recognition that the airplane was not lined up with runway 28 right, reflected breakdowns in crew resource management and led to minimal safety margins as the airplane overflew taxiway Charlie. 8, the flight crew members' lack of awareness about the runway 28 left closure and the crew members' previous experience seeing 2 parallel runways at San Francisco International Airport led to their expectation to identify 2 runway surfaces during the approach and resulted in their incorrect identification of taxiway Charlie instead of runway 28 right as the intended landing runway. 9, although the notice to airmen about the runway 28 left closure appeared in the flight release and the aircraft communication addressing and reporting system message that were provided to the flight crew, the presentation of the information did not effectively convey the importance of the runway closure information and promote flight crew review and retention. 10, the cues available to the flight crew members to indicate that the airplane was aligned with the taxiway were not sufficient to overcome their belief as a result of expectation bias that the taxiway was the intended landing runway. 11, multiple salient cues of the surface misalignment were present as the airplane approached the airport seawall, and one or more of these cues likely triggered the captain's initiation of a go-around, which reportedly occurred simultaneously with the first officer's call for a go-around. 12, the captain and the first officer were fatigued during the incident flight due to the number of hours that they had been continuously awake and circadian disruption, which likely contributed to the crew members' misidentification of the intended landing surface, their ongoing expectation bias, and their delayed decision to go around. 13, current Canadian regulations do not, in some circumstances, allow for sufficient rest for reserve pilots, which can result in these pilots flying in a fatigued state during their window of circadian low. 14, flight safety would be enhanced if airplanes landing at primary airports within Class B and Class C airspace were equipped with a cockpit system that provided flight crews with positional awareness information that is independent of and dissimilar from the current instrument landing system backup capabilities for navigating to a runway. 15, although the investigation into this incident identified significant safety issues, cockpit voice recorder information, had it been available, could have provided direct evidence regarding the flight crew's approach preparation, cockpit coordination, perception of the airport environment, and decision-making. 16, once the flight crew members perceived lights on the runway, they decided to contact the controller to ask about the lights. However, their query was delayed because of congestion on the tower frequency, which reduced the time available for the crew members to reconcile their confusion about the lights with the controller's confirmation that the runway was clear. 17, although the use of line-up and wait procedures during single-person air traffic control operation was not a factor in this incident, the tower controllers should have delayed consolidating local and non-local control positions until line-up and wait procedures were no longer needed. 18, if an airplane were to align with a taxiway, an automated airport surface detection equipment alert would assist controllers in identifying and preventing a potential taxiway landing as well as a potential collision with aircraft, vehicles, or objects that are positioned along taxiways. 19, increase conspicuity of runway closure markers, especially those used in parallel runway configurations, could help prevent runway misidentification by flight crews while on approach to an airport.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Are there any amendments? I think the Vice Chairman may have an amendment.
Yeah, I'm just kind of studying this. Number 14, I'm concerned a little bit about...
Excuse me, if you've got an amendment, please make a motion, see if it's seconded, and then you can discuss it.
I will do that. Okay. I would propose that it be revised to read as follows. Flight safety would be enhanced if airplanes weighing more than 12,500 pounds were equipped with a cockpit system that provided flight crews with positional awareness information that is independent of and dissimilar from the current instrument landing system backup capability for navigating to a runway. That's my motion.
Okay, it's been moved. Is there a second? Is there a second?
Apparently.
Member Denzar seconds. Discussion.
Okay, the reason I'm making this is it seems like it becomes a little bit broad in terms of saying all airplanes landing at Class B and C airports. That's a pretty broad requirement. And do we have data to support that? I haven't seen any, and I know that in discussions with staff, there was an allusion to the fact that FAA had made some recommendations or had something, but I have not seen any raw data that would support this finding, at least as the way it is currently written.
As I mentioned, this discussion about finding 14 really is about recommendations 3 and 4. So,
right.
So we're having that same sort of discussion. So in recommendations 3 and 4, staff originally drafted a recommendation applicable to all aircraft.
Right.
It was discussed, and the feedback that we got on that draft report was that that was an overreach, and we needed to rescope this to a more appropriate population that didn't include, say, a pilot with a Cessna 152 that flies from a grass airstrip in Kansas. So our effort to refocus it had us identify that the risk we're trying to mitigate is that of passengers sitting in airliners on taxiways, and that occurs at airports within Class B and C airspace. So if you're going to be in that environment where your misaligned approach could pose a risk to passengers sitting on a taxiway, you should take advantage of this new technology.
Don't airliners go to other airports as well? I mean, that to me is still expanding it very broadly. The 152 in Kansas is a bit of an extreme case. We have a lot of airplanes that fly into Class B and C airports that are not 152s and so forth. I happen to know one of them, one of the pilots very, very well, who flies into B and C airports regularly. I'm looking for the data that would support this finding, and yeah, where the real meat of this comes in is in recommendations 3 and 4. So we would be getting out of sequence if we jumped into discussing the recommendation before we got to the findings.
Correct. Member Hamady.
First, and I do have a comment. First, I want to ask for staff's opinion on this amendment. Can I do that?
Yeah, we'll do that. We always do. So please go ahead.
Okay. So I have a concern that I've flipped through a very long 131-page report and haven't seen one reference to 12,500 pounds. So I don't see where the data is on 12,500 pounds, so I don't see how we can make a recommendation based on 12,500 pounds and the weight of an airplane. What I do see is this incident occurred at SFO, which is a Class B airspace. Class C also has the aircraft lined up. And in this situation, and I just want to reiterate, you had the potential, if the crew did not execute a go-around of over 1,100 airplane occupants could have been affected given the lineup on the taxiway. So it was a serious situation, and so what you were trying to do was try to address some of the board's concerns about being overly broad, but then focusing it on these types of airports. So, and just to give you a sense, we're not talking Stafford Regional Airport here, which is close to me, but we're talking Class B, San Francisco, Phoenix, Los Angeles, Miami, Chicago, Class C, we're Raleigh, Durham, Portland, Richmond, which I fly out of. And so the risk here is you have significant airport operations, and it shouldn't matter the weight of the aircraft. The risk is what could occur. Could this incident occur in any other situation? And it shouldn't matter, is it 12,500 pounds? Is it less than that? I think it's our duty to determine what happened, why it happened, and prevent it from happening again, regardless of the size of the aircraft. And so I have a lot of concerns about this amendment and the others, and you know, I would just ask, did you at all look at, and I'm sure you didn't because it's not in the report, this issue of 12,500 pounds?
No, we did not.
Okay, thank you. So I think that concludes my concerns there.
What other concerns do we have or comments? Please, Member Denzar.
Thank you, Chairman. I would just like to ask the Vice Chairman his reasons for proposing this amendment. And why 12,500 pounds specifically?
It's a convoluted path to get here, but the point I'm trying to make is, and I think we've had considerable discussion on this, is we have very limited data to support a broad-reaching recommendation to require additional equipment separate from the primary nav equipment that is already installed on virtually every airplane that flies today, and so forth. And I could see considerable complexity and expense being levied and restrictions on all kinds of aircraft going into these kinds of airspaces. There is no data to support the basis that this is a problem. The FAA, whatever data that the FAA has generated, and there was some reference in the report here that general aviation was responsible for 80% of the wrong surface alignments. What they found was, however, that the high-risk alignments, the ones where you're really going to have a problem, all happen with larger aircraft. The small aircraft were not implicated. That's a fact, and FAA had that in their findings, at least in the document that I was able to find, which staff, by the way, was unable to provide. So I'm looking at a memorandum from Flight Standards Service, SRM report addendum for wrong surface landing safety risk assessments. And they basically say, you know, light airplanes have a very low risk because the problems that they incur are in day VMC conditions, not at night. The two examples that we have most recently on this have been large aircraft. It's been an Airbus, and the most recent one was a Gulfstream 4, Part 135. And in our earlier discussions, we had a discussion of, okay, requiring this for all Part 91, and I would advise Member Hamidi, the Part 91 aircraft of all sizes fly into Class B and C airspaces. So if you levy this requirement across the board, you are creating a potentially a significant problem where we have no data to support that there is a problem.
The document you referenced actually says it's medium risk, and it also says that if FAA implements all those safety recommendations or initiatives, that there would be a 7% decrease in the number of wrong surface landings for GA operations. And I would just point out that FAA published a video on July 25th, 2018 called Pilots Learn How to Avoid Wrong Surface Landing, and in that video the FAA stated that, quote, FAA data show that 85% of wrong surface landings involve general aviation, and 89% of those events occurred in daytime hours in VFR weather. So,
there were no other aircraft involved. That's the point.
Excuse me.
Yeah,
so
you're out of order. Sorry.
I mean, I would say the risk here is not, it's not the type of aircraft. It's the incident that could occur. And in this situation, it was a Class B airspace. So you have the same situation at Class C airspace. We're trying to prevent a similar situation, and that's what we should be addressing. It shouldn't be on the weight of a plane where there's even less data because it's not even addressed in this incident report. So I just thank you.
Yeah, just to play the devil's advocate, you say there's little data to support what staff has said, but there's also little data to support the 12,500 pound data. And by the way, I do not believe that this agency should be concerned with a burden to the industry. That should not be our concern. Our concern should be, what are the factors in this event, and what do we recommend to prevent it? So the FAA has the burden to do the cost-benefit analysis. Now, that's not to mean that I don't want our recommendations. Our recommendations have to be practical, but we, as the National Transportation Safety Board, should not worry about that. Now let me make one other comment. The problem with restricting it to B and C is that, remember, on December the 29th, we had a taxiway landing at Pullman, Washington, in a Dash 8, actually a Q400. Pullman, Washington is not even a controlled airport. It is not a Class B airspace. Is it Class C airspace? And I don't think it is.
We don't think Pullman is, but that route services airports within Class B and C airspace.
Yes, I understand that the airplane would have had to come from a Class B airspace. It would have come from Seattle or Portland, going to Pullman and then back. But nevertheless, it landed on a taxiway. So at least the 12.5 requirement would have captured that airplane. Whereas you could have, whereas it would not. So a non-Class B airspace airport has air carrier traffic going in and out of it. So anyway, Mr. DeLisi, any thoughts? I think you were perplexed with the point I was trying to make, but that's okay. Yes, absolutely. So if you, who would you like to make a statement, please?
Yeah, I think, getting a sense of the board here and a sense of the room, I will withdraw the proposed change.
Okay, it's been withdrawn. It's a motion to withdraw the motion, and Member Denzar, you seconded that. So are we comfortable withdrawing it?
Yes, sir.
Okay, the motion has been withdrawn. And so is there any further proposed amendments? Is there a motion to adopt the findings as proposed?
Second.
Moved by Member Weiner, and Member Denzar jumped on the second first. It's been moved and seconded. Any discussion? No further discussion. All in favor of adopting the findings as proposed, signal with a hand and say aye. Opposed? There are none. The findings have passed unanimously. Mr. Jones, will you please read the recommendations?
Probable cause.
I'm sorry, the probable cause. I knew that wasn't right.
Staff proposes the following probable cause. The National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable cause of this incident was the flight crew's misidentification of Taxiway Charlie as the intended landing runway, which resulted from the crew members' lack of awareness of the parallel runway closure due to their ineffective review of notice to airmen, that is NOTAM, information before the flight and during the approach briefing. Contributing to the incident were: 1, the flight crew failure to tune the instrument landing system frequency for backup lateral guidance, expectation bias, fatigue due to circadian disruption, and length of continued wakefulness, and breakdowns in crew resource management, and 2, Air Canada's ineffective presentation of approach procedure and NOTAM information.
Mr. Jones, thank you very much. Are there any amendments to the proposed probable cause? Seeing none, do we have a motion? Member Hamady moves to adopt the probable cause as presented. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been seconded by the Vice Chairman. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of adopting the probable cause as proposed, please signal with a hand and say aye. Opposed? There are none. The motion to adopt the probable cause passes unanimously. Now, Mr. Jones, if you'll please read the recommendations.
As a result of this investigation, staff proposes 7 new recommendations. 6 recommendations to the Federal Aviation Administration. 1, work with air carriers conducting operations under Title 14 Code of Federal Regulation, Part 121. 2, 1, assess all charted visual approaches with a required backup frequency to determine the flight management system auto-tuning capability within an air carrier's fleet. 2, identify those approaches that require an unusual or abnormal manual frequency input. And 3, either develop an auto-tune solution or ensure that the manual tune entry has sufficient salience on approach charts. 2, establish a group of human factors experts to review existing methods for presenting flight operation information to pilots, including flight releases and general aviation flight planning services, that is pre-flight, and aircraft communication addressing and reporting system messages and other in-flight information. Create and publish guidance on best practices to organize, prioritize, and present this information in a manner that optimizes pilot review and retention of relevant information, and work with air carriers and service providers to implement solutions that are aligned with the guidance.
Can I interrupt just for a second? Is that what everyone else has for recommendation 2?
Yeah.
That is? Okay. All right, thank you. I was just, thank you. Sorry to interrupt. My reading was falling behind there. So thank you very much. Please proceed.
Okay. 3, establish a requirement for airplanes landing at primary airports with Class B and Class C airspace to be equipped with a system that alerts pilots when an airplane is not aligned with a runway surface. 4, collaborate with manufacturers to develop the technology for a cockpit system that provides an alert to pilots when an airplane is not aligned with the intended runway surface, and once such technology is available, establish a requirement for the technology to be installed on airplanes landing at primary airports within Class B and Class C airspace. 5, modify airport surface detection equipment, that is ASD systems, that is ASD-3, ASD-X, and airport surveillance capability at those locations where the system could detect potential taxiway landings and provide alerts to air traffic controllers about potential collision risk. 6, conduct human factors research to determine how to make a closed runway more conspicuous to pilots when at least one parallel runway remains in use, and implement a method to more effectively signal a runway closure to pilots during ground and flight operations at night. 1 recommendation to Transport Canada, that's 7, revise current regulations to address the potential for fatigue for pilots on reserve duty who are called to operate evening flights that would extend into the pilot's window of circadian low.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Are there any proposed amendments to the recommendations?
I have an amendment, sir.
Yes, sir, and you've passed out some, so this would be, help us to identify that one.
I've got an amendment to my amendment, so
okay.
This would be for recommendation number 4, to insert the words after collaborate with manufacturers and software developers. So we broaden it out a little bit, so it might not just be hardware, but it could be software to existing equipment. Would you like me to read?
Yes, hang on just a second, please. I believe you've passed this one out, is that correct?
Essentially, I made a few changes to it, though.
Okay, if you would kindly read your proposed amendment.
The amendment to the amendment is for number 4, collaborate with manufacturers and software developers to develop the technology for a cockpit system that provides an alert to pilots when an airplane is not aligned with the intended runway surface, and once such technology is available, establish a requirement for the technology to be installed on airplanes landing at primary airports within Class B and C airspace. So the only thing that's changed is adding and software developers.
Great. And just as a point of order, I don't believe I heard you say the word avionics, but it should say, is it correct? It should say collaborate with avionics manufacturers. Is that right?
That is correct. I'm sorry.
Okay. Do we need to restate the motion? We don't have a second yet, and I want to make sure everybody understands what the motion is.
I just want to make sure that I have the version that says at the end weighing more than 12,000, but that's out
We
now.
struck that.
Okay.
So there's a motion, and if we need to restate it, we can, but does everyone
Second.
understand what the motion is? You've seconded the motion. Okay, it's been moved and seconded to amend recommendation 4 as motion by member Vice Chairman Landsberg and seconded by member Hamady. Is there any discussion? Sir, I turn it to you. If it's your motion, so would you like to comment on any of this?
The purpose of putting this in is to broaden it out a little bit so we don't just focus on the aircraft manufacturer, but to the people who actually provide the equipment. So that would be avionics. And because we have a lot of equipment in cockpits, iPads and such like, it could actually be what you want could be accomplished strictly by software, which would make it, of course, much more available to everybody.
And I'm personally excited about this because, you know, yesterday we were talking, you were saying nobody wants a $10,000 box in their airplane. And I'm like, nobody's saying it's got to be a box. Necessity is the mother of invention. 10 years ago, we'd never heard of an iPad, and now look what we have. We have Overflight and all kinds of neat things there. And so I'm optimistic that if we put this recommendation out there, somebody is going to jump on it and create a very low-cost solution. That's certainly what I believe, and that's what I hope. Any comments? Certainly want to hear from staff.
Thank you. The addition of software developers is an interesting addition that staff concurs with. The draft recommendation just says manufacturers. That includes airframe and avionics manufacturers. To just call out avionics manufacturers kind of eliminates that the airframers have a big role in that too. Companies like Boeing and Airbus integrate all sorts of technology in collaboration with Honeywell. The ROPS system is a great example of where an airframer started out with the concept of protecting the runway length and worked with avionics to develop those cues. So,
well, wonderful. Member Denzar, Vice Chairman Landsberg, I'm wondering if you would consider a friendly amendment based on what we just heard from Mr. DeLisi to say something along the lines, and this is what I'm going to propose as a friendly amendment: collaborate with aircraft and avionics manufacturers and software developers. So we add that in there. Would that be acceptable?
That would absolutely be acceptable.
And Member Hamady, you seconded it, so would that be acceptable for a friendly amendment with you? So any further discussion?
No, sir.
Okay, would you kindly read the amendment again, and then we'll vote on it.
Collaborate with airframe and avionics manufacturers and software developers to develop the technology for a cockpit system that provides an alert to pilots when an airplane is not aligned with the intended runway surface, and once such technology is available, establish a requirement for the technology to be installed on airplanes operating at primary airports within Class B and C airspace.
Sorry,
Please, go ahead.
I think it was aircraft.
And Mr. DeLisi.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's the word I'd inserted, Member DeLisi, or Mr. DeLisi. I saw you shaking your heads, and so go ahead, sir.
either way is fine. Given the choice, airframe would be.
My preference would be aircraft, but then that might exclude air helicopters. So, I mean, what's your choice of words?
I have no strong feelings on the topic.
How about if we went with aircraft? Would that work? Okay, so it'd read collaborate with aircraft and avionics manufacturers and software developers. Any further questions needing clarification? Okay, it's been moved and seconded. There's no further discussion. All in favor, signal with the hand and say aye. Opposed? The motion carries unanimously. Are there any further amendments?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. This is a new recommendation. I would propose establishing a requirement for pilots of airplanes weighing more than 12,500 pounds to reference electronic navigation guidance when available to identify the correct landing surface during visual approaches.
Okay, there's a motion. Is there a second? I will second for discussion. Go ahead, sir.
I'm making this motion because I think it's self-evident after this incident that referencing electronic guidance would have eliminated this problem in the first place. And we also have a problem with many pilots where they select the wrong, not only the wrong surface, but the wrong airport. We've had several incidents of that nature here of late. This would be similar to an additive to the existing wording of 14 CFR 91.129E, which is a requirement for large aircraft and turbine-powered aircraft to comply with glide slope and visual guidance along the way. And this was a requirement in Air Canada's flight operations manuals, but maybe there's some additional incentive here that if it's a federal regulation, people would be more inclined to follow it. So that was the logic behind it.
So when you say the word regulation, do you literally mean a regulation when we say require?
I would, yes, sir.
It is difficult
It may take a while to get that done, but it's a thought.
Yeah, there are other ways to do that. But, okay, any further discussion?
Yeah, I once again have significant concerns about referencing weighing more than 12,500 pounds because, again, I can't see any, I don't see any discussion of that or evaluation or analysis by the staff on that. And our recommendations are weighted and weighed very carefully by the FAA. And I think, you know, while our mission is safety, but we also have to really see what occurred in a particular accident or incident. And in this particular accident or incident, there was no evaluation of 12,500 pound airplanes going into, you know, in this case, a Class B airspace. So I have concerns about referencing something that is not in our report. In addition, and just a question, this was an issue. Air Canada's flight management system required tuning of the ILS frequency. Is that correct? And this was just this was a situation where the crew just didn't. Is that correct? So I think from my standpoint, this is a situation that the crew just didn't follow through with what they were supposed to do to ensure safety. So.
I agree with you. It was required for Air Canada pilots to do that, and they didn't do it. So I think that even if there was a regulation for this, it still would not have made a difference. They just missed it. This is a best practice. Just was getting emails from the director of operations for a major airline in this country, and it is a best practice with all airlines to do this. And so based on what Member Hamady said, I don't think this would have done anything to have prevented this event because it was required and the crew simply missed it.
I withdraw the proposed recommendation.
I'm sorry. Did you say you would propose to
I
withdraw?
will withdraw. I propose to withdraw it.
Thank you. And I seconded it for a friendly amendment, friendly whatever. I seconded it for discussion, so I also would accept that. So Vice Chairman Landsberg is withdrawing his motion. Thank you. And do you have one more amendment?
Not at this time, sir.
Thank you. May we have a motion to adopt the recommendations as proposed? Thank you. It's been moved by Member Weiner and seconded by Member Member Hamady. It's getting late. Is there any discussion? Seeing no discussion, all in favor of adopting the recommendations as proposed, please signal with a hand and say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? There are none. The recommendations have passed unanimously. Does anyone have any additional issues for discussion? Is there a motion to adopt the report as presented?
So moved.
Wow. It's been moved and seconded, moved by Member Weiner, seconded by Member Denzar. Any discussion? Okay, it's been moved and seconded to adopt the report as presented. All in favor, please signal with a hand and say aye. Opposed? There are none. The report has been adopted unanimously by the National Transportation Safety Board. Do any members wish to reserve the right to file a concurring or a dissenting statement?
I do.
Member Weiner, Member Hamady, any others?
I think I'd like to as well, Mr.
And the
Chairman.
Vice Chairman. Well, in closing, I want to thank my colleagues for their preparation going into this board meeting. The board members have met individually with the staff over the last month to present their feelings about the report. Staff replied with a very long and lengthy letter, memo to say how the report would or would not be revised. So I thank all of my colleagues for all of your good work going into the meeting, the preparation, the debate, the discussion. And on behalf of the board, a sincere thank you not only to the investigative staff, but of course to the support staff and the program staff as well. I do believe that the recommendations that we've adopted today, if acted upon, will improve consistency for flight crews and the methods used to auto-tune or manually set lateral navigational device guidance in flight management systems. They also include identifying better ways to present pre-flight and in-flight information about airport conditions and other relevant data. And they include actions to examine methods to more effectively identify closed runways. Additional recommendations, if implemented, would result in systems on aircraft and at airports to alert pilots and air traffic controllers when an airplane is not lined up with the runway. The incident that we discussed today should drive home the point just how costly a mistake can be. And we all make mistakes. If today's recommendations are acted upon, we will have taken steps to ensure that the circumstances of this incident don't happen again. We urge recipients to act on these recommendations to further improve safety so that we do not have to relearn the lessons of this incident at a far greater cost. We stand adjourned.